it's really great to see so many people interested in this topic, right? As Ajay says, I'm a data management coordinator here at EMBL, and so the principles of research data management is really like the fundamentals of my role and what I try to do here. Excellent. We're at 100. Brilliant. I feel like I can get started now. That's a really cool audience size we've got here. So the kind of goals for today's session. So Ajay said this is part of a series that's really going to focus on large scale bioimaging data, and many of the following talks will focus really on that. But today's session is much more generic, right? We're going to try and just talk about what we mean by research data, and what data management aims to achieve, what we're trying to help you guys with by sort of giving these principles and things. And then to focus and kind of help define some of the kind of common things that you will encounter if you're reading about data management and you're trying to adopt certain practices. So first off, we're going to discuss the data lifecycle and what that is and how that is reflected in the way you work. Then the FAIR principles, which is a super hot topic in data management. It's been around for about 10 years, but I think if you look at the titles of the upcoming sessions, I think at least 4 of them had FAIR somewhere in the title, right? So you will encounter FAIR a lot as soon as you're thinking or reading about data management. And then I wanted to reflect a little bit on how some of those practices can be utilized in the context of a large-scale collaborative project. So some of the examples that you'll see later in this webinar series, we'll really go into the details there. We'll still keep it quite high level, but I wanted to think about it not just in the kind of abstract terms, but maybe some of the practical things you might want to start adopting. So that's the layout for today's session. So I will get on with what we mean by research data, right? And fundamentally, this is really just the sources of information that are used to support your scientific research, the conclusions you come to, and the scholarship that you are doing, right? And that can be anything. I think I come from a computer science background. We typically think of this as files on a hard disk somewhere. It doesn't have to be that. Research data can be things that you acquire, for instance, a survey, you're filling in paper forms, that kind of thing. You might digitize it later, but it doesn't have to be digital to begin with. It could be something that you produce, a biological, for instance, a cell line, something like that. That would also be something if it came out of your research. But often we are talking, certainly in this context, about computer files. It could also be things that you have derived from your analysis. So it doesn't have to be the raw primary data you get, but it's stuff that you have produced somewhere in the kind of experimental process. And this would still be considered research data. It's underpinning the kind of conclusions that you draw and the scientific scholarship that you then publish. That's research data, at least as far as I'm concerned. And this can take many forms, right? So it could be text, it can be audio, it can be numbers, and they can be structured in many different ways. It could be in a nice tabular format. They could be sparse matrices, something along those lines, right? It could be imaging data, and I guess we're going to hear a lot more about imaging data in the later webinars about this. Those images could be still, or they could be videos. They could be black and white. They can be color. It could also be things that are much more domain specific. So, for instance, genomic information, right? That's there's a defined structure perhaps to it rather than just generic text information, which could be anything, even if you're using a text file to represent both of those things. It can be, as I mentioned before, kind of survey data where you go out and collect information in the field rather than conducting an experiment in a laboratory. Likewise, it could be an interview with someone. And that is your primary research data. If you're doing something, for instance, psychological research, it may well be that you are interviewing participants and then, in some sense, processing that data to come up to your conclusions later. It may be geospatial information, where things come from in a field or a grid or in the world or in the ocean, etc. Or it could even be something like sentiment analysis, where you read text or you understand things and then you somehow try to quantify what is meant by some text, for instance, which is somehow slightly different from just the original data. But essentially, I want to emphasize here that it can be anything, right? If it's some sort of information that you use to draw on your scientific scholarship, then that is research data. But I guess we will principally focus on imaging data in this webinar series. And so what does data management try to achieve, right? And it actually tries to achieve quite a lot, but in the most extreme case, I think it's probably fair to say that what it's trying to mitigate against is data loss, right? You spend a lot of time and effort and money collecting data, and then if you lose it somehow, the project fails or you go back to the beginning, it's a big waste of time and effort. And there's this little cartoon here, right, about the four stages of data loss, where you don't believe that it happened, then you get annoyed, then you get depressed, and then finally you accept it, and perhaps you either accept that you're not going to graduate or you accept that you go back to the beginning. This, of course, is a cartoon that kind of represents it. Maybe it doesn't feel real to people. So this is a little example that I found on Reddit before. It's a request from a student for a reward. Their laptop got stolen. If you read the thread, they were a psychology student collecting survey information from participants over several years. Their laptop gets stolen. They have no backups of these things. And this is essentially a begging post saying, please, I will pay you to send me the contents of this folder and you can keep the laptop. I just need it back because I can't finish my PhD. There is no resolution to this thread. It's quite a depressing read, but I just kind of wanted to emphasize that this idea of losing your data is not just a theoretical thing or a cartoon. It can happen for real. And as an individual or at a project level, that can be quite devastating. And this is the kind of most extreme thing that data management is trying to make you think about, these consequences and what you might be able to do to mitigate them. At a slightly less extreme level, for instance, other things that can happen, and if you've worked in science for a while, some of these probably will be relatable. So if you join a project that's already running, and there's already been tons of data produced, how do you get started with understanding it, right? You open up a folder or a directory or database or something, and you want to know, well, where is that folder to start with? Where should I be looking? And then once you've opened it up, you think, well, what am I looking at? There's a bunch of files in here, but I don't know what they are. I don't know how they're related to each other. Maybe I can infer something from things. Are these from the same sample or are they from different samples? What species are they from, etc.? How do I get started with understanding this data? Right? And if it's just a folder with a ton of files dumped in it, or a fridge that you open and it has a ton of vials in, and you don't know, they haven't got labels on or something, it would be the same sort of case, right? You wouldn't know where to work from. You might be able to find things and you have questions like, well, I've got two folders and all the files in them have the same names, but they're different sizes. Something has happened in these two folders, but I don't know which one is the one I would start with. Is one before a quality check and one after, or some processing step, etc. And having some documentation and some management around this data to understand the context of what you're looking at is another thing we're trying to achieve with this. Perhaps at the end of a project, you've submitted a paper, and a reviewer comes back with some questions. For example, they look at a plot and they've just got some questions about how that plot was derived, what data underlies it. But this has been several years since the original experiment was done. The paper was published. Maybe people have even left the lab. And you're trying to understand, now you need to answer these questions to get your paper accepted, right? And so you then have internally some questions like, well, where are the data that went into generating that plot? How did we make the plot? Can we find it now, several years after it was originally done and generated? And the answer hopefully is yes, but this is again something that data management would help with, right? Is that the idea that you have some provenance for how your conclusions, your scientific conclusions were achieved. And in a world where we can use AI to generate fairly realistic looking images, for instance, or sequences or whatever, having this provenance of how you originally collected the raw data and perhaps what processing went into producing the conclusions in your scholarship is also really important, right? That you didn't just ask something to make them up, but actually that you did the real rigorous scientific process to get there. And again, data management is hoping to provide the framework for doing that. One final kind of selfish approach to this as well is your paper's been accepted, but the final step is to actually put your data in some sort of public repository to make it available to people. And anybody that's actually tried to do this, it sounds very easy. We will just deposit the data, but it's actually quite a laborious process. You have to find the right files. There will be metadata about the context of those files. Maybe they need to be structured in a certain way. This can be a laborious process, and the less information you've got about the files that you collected several years ago, the more difficult this will be. And then it's suddenly a big delay in getting your paper published, because if you can't get it into a public repository and get a URL for where it is, etc., that can be a real blocker in getting, certainly in certain journals, getting your publication actually published and available to people. But having good data management, where you understand what the data are, how they're structured, what metadata you've already collected, and you can easily provide that with a submission to a repository, should hopefully make your life at this point, this kind of crucial step in the final part of what we're going to call the data lifecycle. By having that data available, it should make your life and your sort of scholarship easier. So most of it, data management, is hopefully about mitigating things that can go wrong and making your life easier, even though there will be some work involved in getting to that point. And my job here is to try and convince you that that work up front is worth the effort compared to the things that could go wrong down the line. And I just have one final example, again, going back to the data loss example. Everything here focuses on scholarship and poor individual PhD students getting things wrong. I just wanted to show it's not always academia where stuff like this might happen. This is a quite famous example where the enormous movie studio Pixar and Disney, in developing Toy Story 2, the movie, at some point, someone ran this command here, this RM command here. It doesn't matter if you know exactly what that means, but if you're not familiar with it, that means delete everything. Essentially, someone was doing some standard tidying up. They ran the wrong command, deleted 90% of the work that had been done over the last 2 years on the film. And then they found out that the backup strategy they had for this had not been working for a month, and they didn't have any backups of all the work that had happened. And the only reason they managed to recover everything was that someone had been making their own copy on a laptop to take home with them, which probably was not what they should be doing. But it did save the production for this, and I suspect they were forgiven for making this transgression at some point. So I just wanted to highlight that it's not just individual researchers, it's not just us, right? These kind of things can happen even in places with huge multi-million-dollar budgets and experience with this kind of approach, right? So, and this is, again, pretty extreme. If they had lost everything, it would be millions of dollars down the drain in this effort kind of thing. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that these things do happen in many forms of work and life. So that's data management. And as I said, it's about trying to make your lives easier in the long run and mitigate these things that can go wrong. Now, I wanted to focus a little bit on what we call the data lifecycle, which is very much like the experimental process, the kind of hypothesize, plan, carry out an experiment, draw conclusions, and start with the next hypothesis. The data lifecycle follows a similar approach, but it's very much focusing on what happens to your data and how it's used throughout a project. So I'm going to say this is the first stage, but it is a cycle. So you can technically start anywhere here, but we're going to start with the plan, right? And this is where you define the strategy for what you're going to do in your data management. So the idea here is that you're thinking about all of the later steps and what you're going to need to use your data. So that might be how you're going to collect it. It might be where you're going to store it. And questions there come with things like, well, how big are the data going to be? Do I have the budget to actually put it on disk in my lab or my institute? Do I need to buy some more storage? And if you do, you want to think about that beforehand rather than after you've collected it. Likewise, do I have the expertise to analyze the data? If not, maybe you need to hire someone that can do that, or find a collaborator, or go on a training course, etc. Those kinds of things are, again, you want to plan them ahead of time rather than getting to the third or fourth stage in our cycle that we're going to get to and then realize that you haven't got the resources to analyze the data, and it's a big blocker. So it's really thinking about these further steps and trying to understand like what the data are and what you're going to need in order to work with them. It also helps to define the the roles and responsibilities of the people in a project for who's doing things. If you're a single researcher working with your own data, then you're probably doing everything here, right? But if you're in a big collaborative project, it probably helps to actually decide whose responsibility it will be to do certain things with the data. For instance, who is it who's going to record the appropriate metadata that you decide, who will take responsibility for putting it in a repository at the end of a project, that kind of thing. And this tries to stop things falling through the cracks and no one taking responsibility for certain steps later down the line. It also helps you identify any risks there might be during the project in data handling. So one obvious risk is, for instance, what if we lose it, or we try, a risk is that we do lose it. How could we try and avoid that? So if your plan is put all the data on a student's laptop and that's it, that's probably not a good plan, but at least you've thought about it at this point and you kind of realize maybe that's a critical frailty in your plan. Similarly, are there ethical considerations that you should have with your data, right? That's a different type of risk, but if you're collecting things, should everyone have access to it? Do we need to put it in a certain secure place because it's human genomic data and we shouldn't just make it available to everybody in our institute or our lab? There needs to be some access controls and that kind of thing. Do we need to talk to the ethics department, etc.? And those are all things that you want to think about with your data, like what are those kind of requirements? And then finally, this helps with facilitate the final point, which is the kind of sharing of data. You're going to need we will talk about the metadata and how you share data later on, but you need to have considered that right back at the beginning when you draw up the plan, like what extra information will be useful when I try to share this later. And all of this goes into what's called a data management plan, which is a document you want to draft early in the project. Many grants require you to write one. And you have to remember it's a living document. The plan can be updated as new things happen. A new experimental technique comes along, an experiment doesn't work and you generate new data. A different person joins the team. You can update it with all of these kinds of things. And it's important to remember that it's totally fine to update your plan. So I spent a long time on planning because I think it's the most critical of these steps, at least as far as I'm concerned. But to just kind of then we will talk a little bit more about the other steps, right? So collecting the data is actually the bit where you run your experiment, right? You go out and talk to people. If you're doing surveys, you harvest the animals and the cells that you need. If you're running that type of experiment, right? You use the microscope, you collect things. But this is the kind of bit where you're actually in the lab doing the data collection. And you should have considered sort of how is this going to work as part of the plan. But this is the kind of hands-on bit where you are generating or obtaining the data that you want to use. Then processing the data is the next step, right? And this is where you convert whatever it is that you collected into whatever format it is that you need to do the analysis, the scientific analysis on it later. So, and sometimes this is very standard. Sometimes it will be a big laborious process. This would be where you do, for instance, quality control, and you discard things that are not suitable or failed the experiment, that kind of thing. What I mean by transforming or converting data, so for instance, if you did survey data, you might well then transform the answers that people gave you into tabular data, which you can then do a statistical analysis on or something like that, right? So there's the primary data of the answers people gave you, but then you generate something and then you will do an analysis on that later. This is also a step where you can homogenize data. So if you've collected data from different sources and maybe they have different IDs attached to them, but technically they're the same organisms or something, you go through a process to try and make sure that all of your data is homogeneous and can be utilized together. And if you've obtained data from somewhere else, you maybe filter out things that aren't suitable for the project that you're actually doing. One key thing here, though, as part of the data management process is that you try and document each of these steps, right? So that you can do it again later and people will understand. As we said, it's about the provenance of your data. So if you document it here, it's about trying to understand the steps that were carried out to go from that raw primary data that you collected to the stuff that you're actually going to analyze. And that's not always easy, but you might be using a workflow manager, you might be using scripts, you might be writing everything down in a paper lab notebook, but it's still important to take these steps to try and document what you do. The next step is analysis. And I think it's easy to kind of blur the lines between processing and analyzing data. But for me, analysis is the bit where we start to generate something new, some new knowledge, right? The processing is about taking data and transforming it somehow, but we're not actually learning anything new about it. And then the analysis is where we start to ask our scientific questions about to answer the question that we're fundamentally trying to look at and investigate in our science. And so that is, for me, the difference between these two things, although the lines often blur. And I think this can either be standardized kind of thing. So it's a new data set, but you're running it through a pipeline that's really well established. People know how it runs, etc. You're just asking a slightly different question because of the data you actually collected. It can also be super exploratory. I've got this cool data set. I don't even know how I'm going to analyze it, but I'm going to try some new things and try to draw some conclusions, but it's going to be a process to get there. Or normally it's a bit of both, I would say. And in all those contexts, capturing that analysis again is kind of a very non-trivial approach, but it's kind of key for this reproducibility thing. So the processing and the analysis, it's important to document what you did to generate things, and to somehow store that alongside the data that you are processing and then the results that you're producing. Now we get to the kind of last parts of the cycle. So preserving the data is basically ensuring its safety and integrity. And you could probably also make a shortcut from collect to preserve. If you wanted to, it's also important to preserve the raw data that you generated. So it's not just about the stuff that comes out of the analysis, but actually the raw data that came from it is often actually the thing that people really want to work with and want you to publish, right? And so maybe you could draw a line across our circle to go from collect to preserve. But it's about storing the data in a way that has some long-term resilience to it. Hopefully it's also organized and described in a sensible way so that people can find it later. And this might involve, for instance, changing where it's stored. Instead of, you would analyze it on your laptop or your big computer in your institute, but you might store it long-term on a tape archive or on a repository somewhere else that somebody else pays for. But preservation is really about saying this is fixed and now I want it to exist for a long time and I'm not going to modify it anymore or look at it again. And then sharing kind of follows on naturally from that. So this is we're approaching the final step of here, right? This is about making your data known to other people. And this is what a lot of funding agencies drive towards. This is why they want you to publish your data, because they would like, and there is a general consensus behind the idea that it would be more useful if data was paid for once but used for multiple studies rather than people generating the same thing multiple times, for instance. So if we can make it available and share it somehow, then that is the final step of your life cycle. And many funding agencies and many institutions, etc., require making your data public as part of the scientific process. It doesn't necessarily mean it's open, and we'll talk about that later. So it doesn't mean that everybody has to get access to it. If there's a reason why, for instance, sensitive human genomic data doesn't have to be open, but it should be acknowledged, the existence of it should be known, and some mechanism to access it should be available for the right people under the right circumstances. And then, yeah, as I said, there's an increasing requirement for sharing this primary data. And you might also want to consider sharing the derived data, so things that come out of either the processing or the analysis steps as well. And there are often places for doing this, either institutionally or public databases funded by large bodies, such as the EBI's repositories. And then the final step here is reuse, which is also potentially the first step in a new cycle, right? This is finding data that other people have shared that is relevant for your science, and then working with that rather than generating your own. So then the collection step would literally be I'll download their data and I'll start working with that rather than running your own experiments. And the idea here is to avoid doing unnecessary experiments. This could be very helpful in circumstances where this can be like a reference data set for your work, right? If you're working on a computational method and you don't really care about the biological samples behind it, you just want, it's not a biological question you have, you're interested in a computational method, for instance, then you can download some data without having to wait for somebody to generate that for you or do it yourself or pay the money for it and that kind of thing. So this is super helpful in circumstances like that. It also allows people to analyze your findings and verify that they're correct, either with their own mechanisms or maybe with another technique or something. And others can also gain new insights by combining several smaller data sets and combining them into a big meta-analysis or something like that. And again, the sort of scaling up that is available by many people making their data available and then others reusing it is potentially very, very beneficial. So those are the various steps of the data lifecycle, and hopefully they are kind of understandable to everybody, and sort of people who have worked with data will appreciate that actually they go through all of these steps at least at some point. And so now I want to move on to the other of our kind of popular acronyms that we meet in data management a lot, which are the FAIR data principles. So FAIR, as I said, it's an acronym. It stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And generally, we consider these principles at the point of making your data publicly available. So the sharing part of the life cycle, and it's something that big public data repositories are always thinking about how they make their data fair. And we're now just going to discuss what those 4 different individual points kind of mean in practice. So, because I think they sound obvious, and then once you start digging in the details, sometimes they can be a little bit more subtle than you realize. But we will start with findable, which I think is probably the most easy to understand, right? This is about, it's very hard to describe this without using the word find, but it should be easy for people and computers to find that data, to locate it, right? And so one general strategy is that there should be some sort of persistent identifier that flags a data set that you have published. So that could be a DOI, a digital object identifier, which there are many distributed registries where if you give a DOI, it links to a particular place where something, it doesn't have to be data, exists. And those can be updated. So even if the sort of URL structure of a website or something disappears or changes, the DOI would still be resolved to the original thing, and they will be guaranteed to be unique. It should always find the same thing, even over many years. And that is very useful in a kind of generic setting where you're publishing data in a kind of non-domain specific format. If you have domain specific data, and I generally recommend people put data in a place that was domain specific if they can. So if you have imaging data, the bioimage archive would be a natural place for that. These domain specific places often have a database specific ID that represents a data set. And that way, if you publish your paper and you say the data are published under this ID, even if in 5 or 10 years' time, the structure of the bioimage archive or whatever repository you're using has changed, the ID should always resolve to the same data set. So you're kind of protected from the idea that things like URLs might change, but someone should always be able to find the data if they're reading your paper and they can identify the ID that's matched to it. Equally important in findable is providing rich metadata to your publication. So it's very good to have an ID, and if someone reads the paper, they can use the ID to find it directly. But if they're just kind of searching for data that meets some criteria, that's looking at the metadata around your data. So describing the context that it was produced in, what samples it's from, etc. And this is equally important for those people who are kind of, they don't know that your data set exists, but they want to find it. And so it should also be in a place that is searchable and discoverable, preferably online. because that's how most of us search and discover things. And so that's findable, right? And so good examples of places that make data findable are generally these kind of public data repositories. So things like that are hosted by the EBI are often domain specific. More general places, for instance, Zenodo or Dryad, etc., they also meet these criteria. They allow you to provide metadata for people to search for it, and also a unique ID that would represent the data set. A not so great example would be putting your data on an institutional web page, right? Which is okay. People might find it, but in my experience over time, institutional web pages change, people leave and their accounts get closed down, the data disappear. They make it available, but no one understands the kind of magic behind Google finding your web page. So a Google search for it doesn't actually ever find it, and then people don't end up on the page, even if it exists. Or similarly, a paper that says data available on request is kind of the antithesis of findable, right? You can't find it at all. You have to email a person, and maybe or maybe not they reply. Moving on to accessible. So I find this one probably the most difficult to define, because I think a lot of the time the definitions online for this are a little bit too technical. The idea behind accessible is essentially that it should be easy for people to get hold of the data if they're allowed to get hold of the data. And I think if you're putting data in a public repository, this is kind of achieved automatically. A lot of the things online talk about standard networking protocols and royalty-free protocols and things. And basically, if you put it on a website and you can click a link and the data comes down, that counts as accessible for me. And I think that this kind of discussion around this is perhaps a little bit, it obfuscates this kind of approach to it. But trying to think of a poor example of this, a kind of extreme and slightly silly approach would be if you could find my data set and I said it's available, instead of by clicking this link, you have to write me an email, you have to send me your address, and I will post you the data on a hard drive, and then you can have it. Which they could find it, but that's not very accessible. And then if I said, well, the hard drive comes with a funny connector and you'll have to buy that to lock it into your laptop, and that's the only way you can get the data off, that's even less accessible, right? And it's a kind of silly example, but that's sort of what we mean by it's very difficult to get the data. They might be able to find it, but actually getting hold of it is a challenge. This doesn't mean that your data have to be open, right? Open and accessible are slightly different things. So accessible under specific circumstances is the sort of caveat for things like sensitive human genomic data, where you might need to sign an ethics approval. It might need to be, there might be an access control committee that decides who gets access to the data. What we would encourage in this situation is that you would still put your data in a repository that supports this process, and that you have the metadata, things that describe what your data are. That should still be open and accessible and easily findable by people, but then they have to go through the process of being approved to actually access things. So there is a slight difference between open and accessible in sort of how we consider access to data. Then we have interoperable, and this one is also slightly difficult to define, but this is about allowing data sets to easily integrate with one another. So ideally, you don't create your data with some proprietary software that only you can read, or at least if you create it with that, that's not what you make available to people. Similarly, if the data you make available require software that has an extremely expensive license to it, that is not particularly interoperable, because other people would have to buy that license in order to work with your data set. So it is encouraged, if you're making things interoperable, to use open formats and software, things that are free, they're not behind large organizations that can, at a whim, change the licensing agreements for using things or the structure of software to make it more difficult for people to read the data, that kind of thing. And likewise, using shared vocabularies to describe the metadata. So I'll show some examples later, but agreeing on how you describe organism names or image data types or the reagents that were used in your experiment ahead of time, so that you don't end up with kind of conflicting versions of the same data. And I just wanted to list a couple of examples again for this interoperability thing. So if you're from the genome sequencing world, you've almost certainly heard of the FASTA format. It's a text file with a limited alphabet. You can open it in any text reader. It's been around for 20 years or so. It's super well established. There is no license behind it. You can open it on any machine. It's a really good example of an open format that is incredibly well established in the field. But I remember about 10 years ago, there was a paper published reportedly about the Sasquatch genome, right? Bigfoot's genome. Naturally, the paper was kind of derided at the time, but they did provide some data. But I remember downloading that data, and it was genome sequencing data available in a PDF format, which is, if we've all tried to copy and paste data from a PDF, it comes out really strange sometimes. There's random line breaks. This is not the format that anybody working with genomics data would ever expect to get their data in. So again, this is a kind of slightly silly example, but it's sort of showing how you can, if you want to, really obfuscate and make life difficult for people by not being interoperable with the data that you make available. And then finally, reusable is about the context of the data that you've produced, and allowing other people to understand exactly how it was produced so that then they can reuse it themselves. And so we want to describe how it was produced, the circumstances around that. Essentially, there should be some rich metadata with many different attributes about it. And you also want to release this with a clear and accessible license. So you want people who can find it and use it and download it to also be allowed to do it by giving them permission to do that with an accessible license. And so I wanted to just kind of say that the final part of the talk today is that we normally consider all of these, as I said, in the kind of context of publishing data at large repositories. It's kind of what they try to do is make data fair. But in large multi-stakeholder, multi-group projects, there's a lot of flow between different partners in the project, etc. And actually kind of all of these fair aspects are useful to consider during the active project phase, not just at the bit where you publish data. And I also wanted to highlight that these are not they are principles, not implementations, right? There is no one way to make your data fair. It really depends on what data you're working with, what fields you're working in, what the expectations amongst people are, and it's a spectrum. You can be somewhat findable or incredibly findable or not very findable, but a little bit, right? And that's all okay. There is no one way that this is fair and this is not, right? It's not a binary thing here. It's definitely a spectrum, and it's not a just do this and your data will be fair either. But it would also be true to say that if you are putting your data in public repositories, you're going a good step towards it. Although even by doing that, you can still make data complicated and difficult to understand, even if you put it in a public repository. So you don't obtain it automatically, but it makes your life easier if that's where you go at the end of the project. But inside a project is a slightly different, there's more consideration for yourself. So I just wanted to talk about them a little bit. Some of the things you can actually try and do inside a project. So for instance, making data findable. You probably want to use, in the simplest case, descriptive names for your files and folders, right? If you haven't got too many things, too many data files, and you give them descriptive names, and there's only a couple of you working on the project, this might be sufficient. You will know what folder to look in. You can read and parse these names, and actually that's enough to find the data that you're looking for in your relatively small project. So you might want to, for instance, encode things like the treatment or the subject ID or the date that the things were produced on. You might want to consider what order those names are constructed in as well. So I've got a little example here, which you probably can't parse, but because I made the example, I know what it means. The first characters at the beginning are a date. It's 1963, March 18th. Then there's a letter which is describing what type of data this is. It's actually a picture. We can tell that from the file extension, the .jpeg. And then because I know what data set this came from, these are the middle points here are the initials of two presidents, Lyndon B. Johnson and JFK, John F. Kennedy. And this is page 1 of a letter between them that was published on that date, right? We've encoded a ton of information in this, but I know that, you may well not have known that without us kind of agreeing on some standard before we even started the project. And that's the kind of key point I want to take here. If you've got a more complex project with many different file types, different and large volumes of data, etc., you probably would find that just the file names is not a sufficient way of making your data findable, right? You need some more advanced form of record keeping. And I'm sure everybody kind of already acknowledges this. You want something like a spreadsheet, maybe even a database that keeps track of the files and the metadata. And then everybody in the project kind of needs to know where that spreadsheet or that database is and how to access it so that they can look up the files that they're interested in and find where those are located. And by providing something like that, you are making the data findable within the project. And if we think about accessible, so this is again, this kind of how do others get hold of the data, right? So I talked about putting it on a website and clicking a link and downloading it. That works fine for your public data. Maybe you can't do that. You can't put it in a public data portal at the point where you're still working and analyzing and producing data. So maybe you need some sort of internal data portal. Maybe that can be agreed file or folder that everybody in an institute can access, for instance. But if you're working across sites, this becomes more complicated. Should everybody push all their data to one location, or should everybody keep the data that they generated but make it sort of its existence known to the other partners in the project? This is a challenging task that I think will probably be touched on in some of the later parts of this webinar series, but it's a challenging thing to approach here, right? And suddenly the idea of shipping hard drives around doesn't seem quite so bad because that doesn't scale to worldwide distribution. But shipping it between 2 or 3 institutes, this might actually be the most efficient way of sending really large data files if your internet connection is not particularly great. And you also at this point want to consider, does everyone in the project have access to all of this data? Should they be allowed it? Did you agree this up front? If you want to restrict the access of people, you need some mechanism for doing that. You can't put everything in a shared file with open permissions to everybody if that's not really what you wanted to do, right? And ideally, you should have discussed this and agreed it all before any of the data are collected, right? So you have some idea of the level of infrastructure you need. But that's the kind of approaches to making data accessible. Then thinking about interoperability, right? So this was about kind of, do they have the software? Is it an open source software or an open standard for representing things? Sometimes there are actually really good reasons for using proprietary software and proprietary standards. And if everyone in the project has access to that software with the particular license, or everyone in the project is working with a particular piece of equipment that produces data in a certain format that is maybe not accessible to the wider world, but everyone in the project can work with it, then actually it might not be a bad choice to stick with that internally. It might not be what you publish right at the end when you make things public, but if there's a really good reason for efficiency or storage spies or something along those lines for using something that is acceptable within the project, even if it's maybe less acceptable widely, then that's okay to do. And so understanding those kind of common resources about what is available to the project partners can maybe help shape some of those choices. And then I think I mentioned the kind of shared vocabularies around metadata and ontologies and things. Again, this is really important to agree in advance. If you are producing data in different sites, you want to agree on how the kind of nomenclature that you're going to use to describe the examples, particularly if they are related, but maybe they're different experimental techniques, but on the same samples or something along those lines, right? And I just put a little example down here of all the different ways, well, this is a tiny subset of the ways you could write, you could indicate that a sample was human, right? You can write Homo sapiens, you can do that with all capital letters or some capital letters. You can have spaces in there. You can not have spaces. You can write human instead of Homo sapiens. You want to agree all of that in advance. Otherwise, if all 6 sites in a particularly large project chose a different way of representing this, it would be very hard to merge those data back together. And someone would have to go in and change all of those entries on one standard thing. And it would have been better to agree that up front. And then finally, we come to the reusable part. And I think internally to a project, when you're not making the data public, but you're just sharing it with your collaborators, this is probably actually just making the data usable, right? If you haven't told your project partners how you created the data, but you're giving it to them, they probably can't do anything with it. And so I'm not sure it's even reusable here, right? If they're the primary person that's going to use it, it's just usable. But I think the actual considerations here, though, are very similar to what you would be considering for the point of publication. And you want to think about them right at the beginning of the project. So you want to think about what provenance information do I need to capture? And one place you can go and look for that is to look at the places you might deposit it right at the end of your project and say, well, what metadata requirements do they have? What are they? Is there an existing metadata standard for the field we work in? And think about how you can capture those right back at the beginning when you're generating the data. Then they're useful during the lifetime of the project that people are working on it. And then they also still exist at the point where you need to provide them in the public deposition of the data. And internally, you want to document how you're doing this, right? So maybe you need to provide things like who the contact point is for each data type, who you should speak to. There should be a README or a manual or something like this. And you also want to think about how you transfer some of this metadata around with the data. Does it go in this data portal, this database that you generated? How do people access it and use it to make things findable? And so my final slide really is that you might have noticed in all of those, I talked about discussing things and thinking about them before you do stuff, right? And so from my perspective, the single best thing you can do, if you want to do one thing, is to start with the data management plan, right? Really, before you generate any data, before you start anything, just start thinking about the data. And it doesn't have to be, a data management plan can be amazing. It doesn't have to be amazing, but just sitting down and thinking about it for a little while about what you're going to produce, who's going to do what with regards to the data, what resources you need, how you're going to exchange information amongst the collaborators in a large project, etc., is really important. And all of those discussions may well be happening, but you're either not writing them down or you don't realize that they are part of a data management plan, etc. So if you take one thing away from today's talk, is that the DMP, the data management plan, is the thing that I would say you really want to do it. You want to do it properly, and it should hopefully save you a lot of time and angst later on when people are trying to untangle knots they get into with the data, either legally or technically or collaboratively, where responsibilities get dropped, etc. And by having a plan that people can refer back to and to understand and can update when new things happen with the project is a really useful thing to have. Yeah, if you take one thing from this webinar, that would be my take-home message. And so with that, I conclude. Thanks very much for listening.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mike. Thank you very much for this very insightful webinar. And it gives us a very great start for the webinar series, putting everyone in the context. So I'll request everyone to go into the webinar series page and join other webinars, because you will hear more about this in the upcoming webinars. So Mike, as you end with the data management plan, our first two questions, I will actually combine those two questions, are about that. So first question is there a checklist or other kind of document that could help us track all these steps, like collection, processing, analysis, data preservation, etc.? And the following question is a bit related, that I had a question regarding the plan phase. Are there sources available in form of templates or guidelines, workflow that ensures all the discussed points are considered or met?
So two very good questions. And I don't know if the people are internal to EMBL or broader audience, but from a broader audience perspective, right, there is a ton of information about this, probably an overwhelming amount, because many institutions provide their own kind of definitions and guidance to their researchers about these things, and you can find an awful lot of it by Google. The actual diagram that I was showing, that comes from a project that's supported by Elixir called RDM Kit. research data management kit. So that they produce the diagram, but they also produce an awful lot of useful information about how to implement each of the steps in that, both kind of practically how to think about it at the planning stage and implement it. They even provide, I think they call them recipe books for specific data types or specific roles within a project about what tools you might use, how you might go about working with specific data types. And I would really recommend that as a resource. It's not the only resource online at all. Similarly, in terms of writing a data management plan, so there's two aspects to this. And I kind of think sometimes there's two levels. There's ones that are required for funding agencies. If you apply for a grant in many funding agencies, they will require a data management plan at some point. These are often super high level, right? They want you to have sort of thought about it. It's a really good start, but they don't care exactly what you're calling your files, right? They want you to know that you've put your file, that you've thought about a file naming system and that you've thought about a backup system in case the laptop crashes, etc. But they don't really need to know we're going to call them date underscore subject underscore, sample number, etc. But that information is really useful for all of your project partners. And so sometimes the kind of template that is provided by a funding agency can be a really good place to start sketching out the ideas. But then there's more detail that you would need to do for the kind of internal one. But it's not a bad place to start with that kind of level of information. And many of the big funding agencies structured their templates around the FAIR principles. I think commonly you will either find them structured around FAIR, how will you make your data fair, interoperable, accessible, etc., or how will you achieve each of the steps in the data lifecycle? Like what are you going to do at each of those steps and write it down? And I think either one of those is a good place to start with this.
Great, thank you. And just to let everyone know, I will also share these slides along with the recording. So on that data cycle slide, I can see there is a reference, so you can actually go in there and look for more details. Okay, thank you. Next question is, could you please elaborate a bit on the accessible versus open data? What if I don't really want others to use my primary data? Instead, I would, for example, want to keep on interpreting these data myself and publish more based on these.
Yeah, so this is definitely a gray area. And the requirements for publishing it are defined in many places, in my experience. So I can really only, from an institutional level, I can only speak about EMBL. But our open science policy says that all primary data should be made public. I don't think it puts a timeline on that. I don't think the wording, it says something vague like as soon as possible, something along those lines, right? So there is some wiggle room. There is also requirements from funding agencies, which also come with statements about making data public. And I don't know which one trumps the other. Does my institutional one trump the funding agency or not? I can't answer that. I don't know from a legal perspective. But in both cases, they require us to make our data public. But I totally understand the perspective on not wanting to do that and to keep it internal because you have more questions to ask for it. My personal perspective, and I'm not a scientist whose career is based on the publications that come out, right? So I have different pressures in what I'm trying to achieve. But my perspective is that putting it public is still a useful thing to do. And I think it's unlikely that people are going to scoop you with your own data that you made public somewhere, asking exactly the same question about it that you want to follow up with. Maybe that does happen, but I feel like you've already got such a head start at that point that it's, and the usefulness is actually in other questions that other people might want to ask of the same data you produced. So really, it's a kind of carrot and a stick kind of thing here, right? Like there is some level of enforcement from institutions and funding agencies, but I don't actually know what the repercussions are if you don't do that.
Great, thank you. Next one is, hello, great talk. Thank you. What could you advise, please, for analyzing or imaging data, retrieving in some years when the program to open that data file got another advanced version or got extra payment or got corrupted, and I cannot access it no matter which proper preservation strategy was used that time. So it could have been PhD data for publishing a paper already as a postdoc, or another is from another continent.
Yeah, this is unfortunate, right? So this is the sort of situation that we try to avoid by encouraging people to publish the data in an open format, right? The idea behind an open format is essentially the standard, like how the data are represented inside that file type, is well known. And multiple people could write software that would read it, and then there may be, even if one piece of software disappears or starts supporting a newer version, a different piece of software can still support the older one. That's the idea. Whereas if you use a format that is only readable by the software provided by some proprietary company that charges you for it, and they remove support for it, and they are the only provider of that software in the whole world, there is nothing you can do. And so that is what we're encouraging to do. Obviously, if that actually happens and you have some data that you can't open, I don't know what the answer is here, right? Like maybe there are projects that have some legacy conversion thing that might help you. So even if you can't open it, maybe there is something that will allow you to convert it to another format which you can then work with. I think the details there would really be specific about this particular data set that you're talking about. But that is exactly the scenario that we are trying to avoid by encouraging the interoperable approach where we use an open standard for the data that gets published.
Thank you. Okay, so the next one is, sometimes spreadsheets are not the best way to keep information because you end up with tons of columns and rows and it is hard to read the data. Are there any alternatives that you could recommend?
Yeah, I guess this is the scenario where you start to need a database, right? And then you need a person who understands how databases work. So if the project gets too big and too complicated, and I completely agree that sometimes a spreadsheet is sufficient and sometimes it really isn't, that then you start to need someone who understands either data management or database management as part of the project. Obviously, if this happens in an individual project with one person, but you have lots of data, that's very difficult to find the resources behind that. But typically in a larger project, this is where I would advocate that again, the planning stage, you need to think about it. How are we going to store this information? How are we going to keep track of them? And if you realize you've got thousands and thousands of files across different sites with different parameters around them and things, then a database is probably the place you need. It might be, so again, at EMBL, we actually have several in-house data management tools where you can register samples, and they have a big database behind them, and they understand the biological context, as in what metadata might be appropriate for the data types that we work with here. If you're lucky enough to be in a situation like that, you don't have to do it yourself, but you're then using a dedicated data management tool. And again, there are other free versions of this that you can use as well. But that's where you start to move towards something that's sort of a bit more sophisticated than just using a spreadsheet.
Great, thank you. So we already have had an hour, but I can probably take a couple of questions if that's fine with you, Mike.
Yeah, that's fine.
Are there any rules or suggestions to name files that belong to the same experiment? Sometimes you have to generate a tool, for example, a probe that will be used to carry out the actual experiment, for example, an in situ hybridization. They all need to be documented and belong to the same experiment. What information could be included in the file names to keep track of this?
So it's a very open question, and I don't think there is actually a correct answer here, right? Like it's up to you and in the context of your experiment to know which are the most pertinent pieces of information that you might want to encode in the file name. You can obviously encode as much as you want. You can just keep putting things in as long as you have some sort of structure that you understand. You can keep making the file names longer and longer. Eventually, you might run into some sort of limit on certain operating systems about how long you can make file names. But also it becomes unwieldy at that point. And actually at that point, it probably becomes appropriate then to go for a data management tool, or maybe a spreadsheet would be sufficient, where you map a name that encodes some information, a sample ID, a treatment ID. It doesn't even have to be just the names. You can put them in folders as well to structure things. So the kind of full path represents the information, not just the name of the individual files. But then you map the naming that you have done onto a row in the spreadsheet where the additional pieces of information are then contained in extra columns after that. I think that would be, I mean, I find it very difficult to give you a solid answer to this as to what pieces of information would be the most appropriate to put in there. Because I think that also really comes down to what you're doing with the data, what analysis you're wanting to do. So if you wanted to select files that were generated on a certain date, probably put that in there. And maybe even put that first, because then you can sort by date, right? And maybe that would be sufficient. But if you're not interested in the date at all, then don't put that in the file name. And maybe that is useful information, but maybe that can go in the spreadsheet later. And actually, treatment versus control is the most important thing that you're interested in, or organism, humans and mouse, right? And then you separate your data that way. So I'm afraid this is a waffly answer that doesn't really answer the question, but I think it's very specific to each individual experiment.